Critical History is back with part 2 of our series on the 30 Years' War. As a result of ongoing research, I've come across some really fascinating bits of information. The problem is that presented in isolation, that is all they appear to be. Isolated incidents and anecdotes. What is clear is that this period, the first half of the 17th century, was a time of great upheaval, and not just in Germany or Western Europe. If you watched the last video, you probably remember that at the end I mentioned that when the 30 Years' War ended, serfdom was instituted in Russia and that Scotland and England found themselves in civil wars. Well, that's just the beginning. It turns out, at the conclusion of the 30 Years' War, France underwent what was called the Fronde, or I suppose Le Fronde, the revolt. Basically 5 years of turmoil and civil war. And before the 30 Years' War started, Muscovy and Poland had fought what is called the Polish-Muscovite War of 1605 to 1618. The 17th century is considered the bloodiest century in Irish history. And from 1623 to 1639, the Ottomans and Safavids in Persia had a long-running war as well. China transitioned from the Ming dynasty to the Qing dynasty in the same period. And here's a good one. Did you know that from 1616 to 1636, Japan became increasingly isolationist, culminating in foreign trade with Japan only allowed on Dejima, a small artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor? For the next 200 years, any Christian Europeans who landed on Japan's shores were put to death, executed without trial, let alone a right to appeal. Now, I know what you're thinking. One video we're talking about a Bohemian revolt, and now all of a sudden, here we are talking about limitations on foreign trade in Japan? Is there a connection? Now, that's not an easy question to answer, but obviously I wouldn't mention it if I didn't think some sort of a connection existed, beyond the fact that these events all happened at or around the same time. Generally speaking, it seems there was a higher level of cooperation and interdependence before the period of the 30 Years' War. One of the words used to describe it was Tartaria, and another one was Pax Ottomana. Basically, it appears as if the world descended into a sort of global civil war, or maybe the disintegration of an empire. This is a vast topic that deserves a lot more study, but I thought some of these points deserve mention, and it should be obvious at this point that one of the ways to lie about history and deceive people is to decide arbitrarily the causes, extent, and duration of a major conflict, such as this one. Alright, so where were we? Yes, at the end of the last video, we had just finished with what is generally considered the first phase of the 30 Years' War, the collapse of the Bohemian Rebellion. There was no fighting in 1624, but in 1625, the King of Denmark was elected as Director of the Lower Saxon Circle. The imperial circles were groups that were formed for organizing a common defensive structure in times of conflict. The Danish king, Christian IV, was eligible because he held lands in Holstein. Now, an interesting fact about Holstein, the Russian royal family, the Romanovs, for centuries married with nobility from Holstein. And it was actually the house of Holstein-Gottorp Romanov that ruled Russia from 1762 until their brutal assassination in 1918. Check out my video on the Bolshevik Revolution if you want to know more. So in December 1625, the Hague Alliance was formed. The Dutch, the Danish, and the English. England paid 300,000 florins per month, and the Dutch paid 50,000 florins per month, which probably works out to a few billion annually in today's terms. And the responsibility for the Danish king was to keep an army in the field of at least 30,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. The The following April, about 40% of this army was headed towards Dessau on the Elbe, today in eastern Germany. The Imperial Army arrived first though, and they had more troops. The commander of the Danish forces didn't know this, and he attempted to march his army over the bridge, which bottlenecked them and resulted in a devastating rout, half of the army being captured or killed. Christian, meanwhile, was leading his troops toward Upper Austria. In August 1626, they ran into the Catholic League's army, long before reaching Austria, in central Germany, where they fought the Battle of Luta. Both sides had about 20,000 troops, but it seems the League made better use of their artillery. The Danish troops lost their organization, which is usually due to inexperience, and the League's commander, the Count of Tilly, ordered a cavalry charge. The Danish king fled, 3,000 of his men were killed, and another 4,000 were captured or deserted. As a result, Christian, the King of Denmark, lost the confidence of the Protestant German princes, and they removed their support for him, each negotiating a separate peace with the empire. The remaining troops were spread into small groups over a vast area, and they were basically eliminated one by one over the next year or two. The war, by all accounts, should have ended here, with a conclusive victory for the imperial and Catholic forces. But it seems that the emperor's Jesuit confessor, a man named Lamor Mani, insisted on harsh terms, known today as the Edict of Restitution. Basically, all the Protestant gains over the previous 75 years, everything since about 1555, was to be rolled back. At this point, though, it seems even Catholic electors in Germany began to have their doubts, fearing that too much power would as a result be centralized and come under imperial control. They voted to dismiss Wallenstein, who had been the general of the imperial armies until this point, and reduce the size of the Catholic League and Imperial Army. Well, remember how I mentioned in the first video that after the Ottomans got involved, the Polish invaded Moldova? After that, Sweden invaded the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And if you remember what I said about Poland and Muscovy, in other words Russia, fighting a long war, then you understand why the Russians supported the Swedish invasion. I told you this was a world war. Well, in 1629, the Poles made peace and agreed to pay tribute to Gustavus Adolphus. Well, in 1629, the Poles made peace and agreed to pay tribute to Gustavus Adolphus. This allowed him to focus his efforts on Germany. In July 1630, the King of Sweden invaded Peenemünde, which has an interesting history of its own, but it's a long story. After only a few days, they had occupied the capital of Pomerania, Stettin. In the next year, the Catholic League struck back, though, by capturing Magdeburg, sacking it, burning it, and reportedly massacring all its inhabitants. This is considered the single worst atrocity of the war. And this actually set the tone for the rest of the war, and atrocities, war crimes, and civilian casualties at the hands of both armies were ramped up as a result. Now, we're not going to be able to discuss the conclusion of the war in this video, but there is time to discuss one of the pivotal battles, the Battle of Brighton, which is in east-central Germany near Leipzig. For Gustavus to move south, he had to move through Saxony, and for the Catholic League's forces to defeat the Swedes, they had to move north, also through Saxony. Not an easy situation for the Saxons in which to remain neutral. So the Saxons joined with the Swedes. They contributed about 18,000 men to the 23,000 Gustavus already had, whereas the Catholic League had a massive army of 35,000 themselves. Just imagine a football stadium jam-packed full of fans, and you have a pretty good idea of how many soldiers there were in this battle. Both sides had cavalry, muskets, pikemen, artillery, but it's believed the Swedish army's artillery was more mobile and slightly more numerous. The Catholics then would have had fewer cannons, but the ones that they did have were larger. It also seems that the muskets, the arquebus used by the Swedish, were slightly more modern than that of their opponents. So this may have given them the advantage in terms of increased range or accuracy. They were also drilled differently, an innovation for the time, in that they lined up to fire and then would recycle to the back to reload. So basically the idea that we have of pre-modern combat, of musketmen blindly marching forward in a line in lockstep with one another, was used for the first time in a major battle at Brighton in September 1631, but not only that, it was wildly successful. At this time, the Catholic League was still using tercios, musketmen and pikemen in squares, which prevented them from firing as a group. It was effective against cavalry charges and attack from all sides, but against a line of infantry like the Swedes were using, it was actually at a disadvantage. The Swedes also innovated by using salvo fire. Basically 3 ranks of musketmen, those in the front kneeling, those behind them crouching, and the third line standing upright, all firing at the same time. What is interesting is not only the innovations that arose from this battle, but that its size was basically unprecedented for another 30 plus years. And these battles were usually a stalemate in the center between musketmen, but they were decided by cavalry engagements on the flank. If your cavalry lost or retreated and the opposition started charging you from the flanks, well, let's just say even the bravest of men ran under such circumstances. So after 5 long hours of fighting, the Swedes and Saxons prevailed. Actually, the Saxons retreated, but the Catholic League's cavalry was forced to regroup, and while they were doing so, the Swedish cavalry was able to capitalize on the confusion and lack of cohesion. After putting the cavalry to flight, Gustavus captured the League's guns and actually used them on the retreating Catholic tercios. After this victory, the tide turned as allies swarmed to Gustavus's side. An interesting side note, the French were actually subsidizing the Swedish army to the same or greater amount as the English and Dutch had subsidized the Danes. Now that just about does it for this video, but we're not done with the 30 Years' War just yet. It still continued for another 15 or 16 years after the Battle of Brighton. But I did want to leave you with another interesting point. Did you know that the word amnesty is related to the word amnesia? Now, why do I mention this? Because at the end of the 30 Years' War, the Treaty of Westphalia, Article 2 stated, and I'm slightly paraphrasing, "There shall be on both sides a perpetual oblivion, amnesty or pardon of all that has been committed since the beginning of these troubles. All that has passed before or during the war, in words, writings, hostilities, shall be entirely abolished, buried in eternal oblivion." The idea that in order for there to be a lasting peace, much had to not only be forgiven, but more importantly, forgotten. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like an order for history to be rewritten if there ever was one. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hit that like, double tap to subscribe, check out my book, Conquest of Truth. I know you want to. And until next time, stay critical.